All right, guys, we made it. Last day of CPA prep. I would like to say you've made it and you passed the CPA exam, but unfortunately, I have no control over that. So, we're taking one step along the journey, but it's a journey of many steps. When I was going through the questions yesterday, it seemed like most people were still working on the questions when I was doing the review. So I've done a little bit of a different approach. I do have some things I want to talk about, and I've selected some questions to go through. I don't know specifically what questions you're struggling with. So if there's any topics that you come up with and want to go over, feel free to shoot or to raise a hand. We can talk about it. I think I've got a nice cross section of topics to talk about today. Before we do though, let's go ahead and do our story for the day. So this is called "Come Summoning the Cost Accounting Fairy," and you may wonder where that context comes from. So in spring 2029, I was trying out an assignment in my auditing class. Or sorry, 2019, sorry. I'm looking for the future. I'm going to do it again. 2019, I was testing out an assignment. It's called Inquiry and Corroboration because I wanted to kind of reinforce some soft skills in my classes. And the idea was that students would go to professors and they would ask them questions about their bios and then corroborate that information through the training website, which it was an interesting assignment. It didn't hit all points. I think a lot of students were just like, this seemed like extra work. And so I'm still tweaking the assignment for use in the future, which is why I only did that one semester. But Dr. Otero, she requested that I send her the questions that we were going to ask for the assignment. And you can kind of see here are the questions that are listed out here. But the last question I threw on there was, according to Dr. Otero, how do you summon the cost accounting theory? All right. And I admitted I may have made that last one up. So Dr. Otero is incredibly conscientious, replied as follows, says, "Thank you, Michael. By the way, to summon the cost accounting fairy, each IM assignment SEMA 5 times while walking counterclockwise with a copy of the new IMA ethical standards above your head." That's an actual response from Dr. Otero. She actually said that, okay? So, but it doesn't stop there because if I get an opportunity just to drag my coworkers, then I'm going to do it. So here's what I did. I went to Facebook and I said, post it with comment or context, and I just put a reply on Facebook. So now we've got jokes about summoning the cost accounting fairy and the student School of Business, so our School of Business Professional Practice now. Anyway, I probably should share that with students much earlier, so that way they can engage with Dr. Otero. I said, "Dr. Otero, can you tell us again how to summon the cost accounting fairy?" I'm sure she's forgotten by now, but I could always send her a refresher, I'm sure. Yeah. All right, so section 5 and 6, you're probably looking at a lack of familiarity with section 5 and 6. So cover a lot of topics that are not consistent with everything else. Now, I do want to talk about some specific things, but I want to give you some very general advice about how to approach questions in this area, because you will be asked questions in this area on the exam. And in the past, when students have been asked questions about this, they've gotten really, really nervous and anxious about them because this is not an area that we cover in depth. So as I said last Monday, or I said on Monday, first of all, do not sweat this too much. They're not going to go super in depth on this. This is the low-hanging fruit section. With the auditing section, they will go into super detail. And that's the area you should focus on. So 1 through 4 are by far more important with respect to the study time that you're going to spend. That being said, there are things in 5 and 6 that you do need to know, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. But if you run into a question that you're just not sure, it says, "I'm not sure how governmental accounting works in this context," or "I'm not sure how assurance and review services work in this context," my best advice for you is to take it into a familiar setting. Look at it as a question, say, if I were doing this from an auditing perspective, how would I approach this? Will it give you the answer 100% of the time? No, okay. Will it give you the answer more times than not? Absolutely. And this is something that I've incorporated into a lot of the questions that we're going to talk about today, is saying, let's just simplify this and think about it from a scenario that we're familiar with. So that's going to be a good approach. Now, I do have a few things that we're going to talk about. And this first one, I've got a lot of questions that actually refer to this. So I apologize because I was looking at the number of questions that I went through. I said, I probably went a little bit too far on this one. But I mentioned this early on. I think I mentioned this last Thursday when we started. It has to do with the term disclaimer of opinion. When we talk about this from an audit perspective, disclaimer of opinion is generally considered to be one of the opinion types that we will render in a financial statement audit. And that has not changed. But the term disclaimer of opinion itself actually means an opinion is not given. So when you see the term disclaimer of opinion from audit, you're saying this is an opinion type. When it's used in the context of these questions, it literally means you do not issue an opinion. Disclaimer of opinion means no opinion issued. So then we're going to see this in a few scenarios where there's going to be questions about what would you do in the scenario you see disclaimer of opinion. And it's natural to think, oh, if it's a disclaimer of opinion, this is not an audit, so we're not issuing that type of opinion. Think about it again from the nuance there, from the very basic context, not the nuance, the basic context. It literally means no opinion rendered. And if it's a scenario where we do not issue an opinion, then the term disclaimer of opinion is actually correct. Okay. And that's something that's really confusing. I don't like the fact. I would rather they make that a little bit different. They kind of separate that out and they say disclaimer of opinion is the category of the type of opinion rendered, even though it literally means a no opinion issued, from actually no, there's no opinion required in a certain scenario. Okay. So this will be where you focus on. If you look at a scenario like a preparation engagement or compilation engagement, where literally we do not issue an opinion, the term disclaimer of opinion would be appropriate in that scenario. Also, I cannot emphasize this enough. As you are going through and reading through your materials, when you get to the topics that come or that deal with independence and ethics, but especially with independence, spend sufficient time on that. Becker, I don't think spends as much time as I think is necessary on independence. This is an area that you should spend a lot of focus on and make sure you know very, very particularly the independence rules. And if you don't recall the independence rules, if you're not familiar with those and you don't feel comfortable with what Becker tells you, send me an email. I'll send you my slides from the chapter 21 that we went over the independence rules. Sorry, code of professional conduct. We went over the independence rules. It's been in all the auditing classes that I've taught. So you may or may not still have that available. I have never talked to a student who's taken the CPA exam and said there was nothing on independence on the auditing section. There was always questions on independence, whether that be a few multiple choice questions to task-based simulations. Task-based simulation is most likely going to be a scenario where you'll see that. So spend plenty of time learning the independence rules. It's going to be important for you to know as a CPA anyway, because it's part of the CPA Code of Professional Conduct. But I can't emphasize this enough. This is something that even if it's only like 1 or 2 pages in Becker, I don't remember off the top of my head how many pages it is. But if it's only a few pages in Becker, this should be an area where you have substantial emphasis and spend more time on than probably is necessary. Well, probably spend as much time as necessary, which is probably more than Becker wants you to spend on. It's a really important one. And if you come up on the CPA exam and you don't encounter any questions on independence, you're free to shoot me an email says, yeah, Dr. Barnes, you emphasized this and I didn't see anything. That will be the first time that I've heard somebody say there were no questions on independence. So this is just one area where I think there's likely to be questions and you should probably stay focused on those. All right. I don't know how long this is going to take. It depends on how long we talk through. Some of the stuff's going to be unfamiliar, but we're going to go through this. And then I've got a task-based simulation that I want to wrap up with. We'll see what happens where we're at when we get to that point. But we'll probably go through some of these and then take a quick break so I can get set up and then we'll do the rest. All right. We're going to start out talking about the integrated audit. Now, remember when we talk about integrated audit, this is what we discussed, the type of audit we discussed back in 417. And there's not really a context for difference from back then. So when we talk about it in 417, we said we're doing public company audits. And public company audits require that we test both financial statements and internal controls in an integrated way, because information from one gives us information about the other. That's required for public company audits. Now, can you do an integrated audit in a non-public company setting? Can you do it for a non-issuer? The answer is yes. Okay. You would test both financial statements and internal controls. That's basically what you would need from integrated audits. But the integrated audit is only required for public company audits. Now, this is a really important distinction because you may or may not see questions regarding non-issuer audits where they say testing of controls. If it's not an integrated audit, testing of controls is not required for non-issuer audits. It's only in integrated audits that we have testing of controls required, and then specifically internal controls over financial reporting. So keep that in mind as we're going through these questions. All right. Some of these questions, I will readily admit, are not great questions. This has been a recurring theme over the past week and a half where I say, this is a terrible question. And you may ask, why are you asking this question? And the answer is that you will have to be prepared to answer questions that are not particularly well worded. Hopefully on the CPA exam, they're not as confusing as some of these, but I do think that there's important takeaways from these questions. So let's start out with 3071, 3071. All right. So the question for this says, how do the scope, procedures, and purpose of test of controls in an audit in the internal control of a non-issuer compare to those for obtaining an understanding of internal control and assessing control risk as part of a financial statement audit of a non-issuer? Okay. Now, this is going to be the first question where we're going to see a lot of this type of scenario. When you break this question down, and you'll notice this is not an AICP authored question, this is a Becker question. So this is one of those ones that say be danger. This is kind of seems like a trick question. And in nature, it kind of is a trick question. But it's not so much a trick question in the fact that I think they were trying to mislead you. I think they're trying to get you to read the question for the context before you answer the question. So if you remember what we talked about in 417, in 417, I told you that understanding of internal controls is always required in every single audit that's performed. It does not matter if you plan on testing zero controls over the entire course of the audit. An auditor is required in the planning and risk assessment phase to obtain an understanding of internal controls. Okay, you have to have at least a cognizant knowledge of what the client's control structure looks like and their controls are acting like. So understanding of internal controls is required. Okay. However, this is different from testing controls. Testing controls have a much broader context, and we're talking about required testing. Okay. So even though understanding is required and testing is not required, or testing is not required, there is a big gap between those. Okay. So the question here is basically saying, how do the scope, procedures, and purpose of test of controls in an audit of internal control of a non-issuer company? So how do test of controls differ from just simply gaining an understanding of controls? The answer is they're night and day different. Okay. When you're getting an understanding of controls, that's a very, very preliminary assessment. That's why it takes place during planning and risk assessment. You're just trying to get a big overview. When you test controls, you're trying to establish, are they designed properly? Are they working properly? Did they match the assertions that we're testing? So basically, the scope, procedures, and purpose of test would be completely different in all contexts when we test controls than if we're just trying to gain an understanding of controls. So do you see where I'm going with this? That all three of these are going to be different. All three of these are going to be different, which is why B is the answer. All right. Let's see a familiar statement is going to be made on this next one. This is 86, 89. We're still talking about the integrated audit. All right, when planning an audit of the effectiveness of an entity's internal control and integrated audit of a non-issuer, an auditor would be least likely considered which of the following factors. All right, so this goes back to an old thing that I told you back in undergraduate auditing. Remember, when you're looking at a question, to make sure that you pay attention to what phase of the audit you are in. And you will notice that at the very beginning of this question, it says, when planning an audit. So that tells you right now that we are in the planning phase of the audit. So all you really need to read in this question is that when we're in the planning phase, what are things that we can do? Okay. Or in this particular question, it says least likely. What is something we would not do during the planning phase? So let's just go through the answers. Would we evaluate the operating effectiveness of internal controls in the planning phase of the audit? What do you guys think? See a little bit of shake of head. The answer is no, we would not do that. That is a test of controls. That is by definition a test of controls. So that's our answer. But let's go through the rest, okay? A is our answer, but let's go through the rest. The type of available evidential matter pertaining to the effectiveness of the internal controls. So you're trying to plan the audit. You're trying to say, what types of tests can we conduct? That sounds like a perfect planning step, okay? The extent of recent changes in the entity and its operations, that's risk assessment by definition. So that would definitely be planning steps. Preliminary judgments about the effectiveness of internal control. That word preliminary is a big clue that gives you that understanding step that you were talking about before. Is control going to be effective? We're going to make our preliminary control assessment control risk assessment, sorry. So this is the only one that we would not do because that's by definition a test of control. All right, 8945. Okay, so this is a SOC question, which really doesn't relate to integrated audit, but I think that there's an important question about SOC. By the way, if you don't like SOC, do not take ISC, okay? Do not plan on studying for ISC. There's just a bunch of stuff in SOC. Now, I'm going to kind of do my skew. If you're planning on trying to figure out which discipline you want to sit for, ISC is definitely one of those ones that I think is very manageable by any student at Truman State. You have definitely some technology knowledge, and it's a lot of memorization, which Truman students tend to excel at very thoroughly. So if you're trying to think about that, that's a possibility. I'm not saying you should take ISC. I'm saying that if you're considering about what you're going to take, but ISC has an entire section, entire chapter, I think, I believe it is, on SOC reports. So if you hate SOC, don't do ISC. That's all I'm going to tell you. So remember, service organization controls, or system and organization controls. What is the purpose of system organization controls? The answer is that we as businesses nowadays, we integrate with other businesses, and an auditor needs to know everything that affects the controls of the client that they're auditing. That includes having knowledge about external entities that have an impact on controls of our clients. Now, the one example that they like to use a lot, and I think it's an outdated example, but it's one that the CPA exam loves to use, has to do with payroll processing. Because it's long been known, this has been going on for probably half a century, is that companies will outsource their payroll function to payroll companies. So they say, we don't want to have a payroll department, we're going to have you do the payroll for us. Think about the implications of something like that. If somebody else is doing the payroll work for you, that means that they have information about your operations and organization, and they have a direct effect on the control and the risks that your company is related to, because they have information about your employees, about their personal and identifiable information, about their pay scale, and they have to take custody of that information and basically provide that. If they're closely integrated with your control system, especially your information technology, that can be problematic. That's something we actually talked about in advanced AIS. Remember the Target fiasco, the Target data breach? That was because they had a vendor that was directly integrated to the system, the point of sale system, and somebody actually managed to integrate to the vendor, or to the vendor actually hacked the vendor, and they were able to hack Target for that data breach. Okay, so companies that have direct integration into your organization, and they provide services for the organization, they affect your control structure. Now, the answer to this, the optimal answer would be, is if I am an auditor, I'm going to audit not only my client, but I'm going to audit every single entity that has interaction with my client, a system interaction with my client. That is not a practical answer. Obviously, I said this is an ideal answer. That would be something. That's why I had infinite time and resources, which I don't. Okay, no auditor does. So the solution to this is to say, all right, let's talk to the auditor of the service organization, and let's ask them to prepare a report, a SOC report, that basically has information about this organization. Okay, so this is something that's become increasingly prominent as entities have become more integrated over time, and it's really, really important. So think about that from SOC perspective. I think this is not the only question we're going to talk about SOC. We're going to talk about a few of these. All right, so if a service auditor is unable to obtain a written assertion from the service organization's manager regarding its system and suitability design of operating effectiveness and internal control, it would be most appropriate for the auditor to do what? All right, so this is actually asking about the service auditor themselves. Now, you can actually ignore the word service in this context, because basically all it's saying is, if the auditor of an entity is unable to test the design and operating effectiveness controls, will they be able to do what? Now, in a regular audit, we'd say that's not a problem because control tests are not required. But keep in mind, in the service organization control report, or system organization control report, a SOC report, this is the important point, actually providing information about the testing, the design and operating effectiveness controls. That's what you're developing a report for. So this is a required component. If you are not able to do that, you can't do your job. What do we call that when you auditor can't do their job? The scope limitation, okay, a scope limitation. Usually in terms of scope limitation, we're going to be in some scenarios say issue a qualified opinion, which we can't do that because this is a required point of the issuance report, or in the extreme opinion, which is going to be our answer here, we're going to basically issue a disclaimer opinion or withdraw from the engagement. So the answer to this question is basically going to be A, withdraw from the engagement unless prohibited by law. Now, the question came up last year, what are some scenarios where you'd have to actually do it, or where you cannot withdraw from the engagement unless prohibited by law? If there's a legal requirement, like through a governmental agency, to provide system and organization control reporting, then that would be a situation where the auditor could not do that. They basically would have to go to the regulatory agency that's requiring this SOC report and say, we can't do the job. You're going to have to put a little bit of weight on the client to make sure that allow us to do the testing of the design and operating effectiveness controls. Now, I think that's a very rare scenario. In most scenarios, it's just basically withdraw from the engagement, full stop. But that would be a caveat that might be relevant here. So I don't know why they included that in the question, because I guess maybe they were trying to fathom some very rare scenario where you could not withdraw from an engagement. But that's basically it right there. A is our answer. Okay, 5614. All right. This is another question similar to the one that we talked about 2 questions ago, where you have to read the question carefully. In which case might an auditor of an issuer render a qualified opinion on internal control? Now, this is a really specific question because it says of an issuer, which implies an integrated audit. And they're actually issuing an opinion on internal controls over financial reporting. So what are the possible opinions that could be rendered by an auditor, a public company auditor, over internal controls or financial reporting? Well, obviously there's unqualified. That's the clean opinion for public companies. Okay. Then we've got disclaimer of opinion, where we can't do that. We couldn't do our job, so we can't issue an opinion. And we got adverse opinion if there are material weaknesses. That's it. Those 3 types of opinions. Did you hear what was not in that? I did not ever mention qualified opinion, because we can't issue qualified opinions in reports over ICOFR. So you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, what are the possibilities for a qualified opinion? If you know the answer to starting out with this and saying there are no options for qualified opinions because qualified opinions do not exist when testing internal controls, then you can answer this question very easily. The answer is neither 1 nor 2, because qualified opinions don't exist in internal control or financial reporting. Again, you'll know it's not an AICPA authored question. This is mostly testing your knowledge over that. I don't think you'd see a question like this on the exam. All right, I want to take a quick leap over. Before we start the next question, I want to look at some information in A5. So one thing that I think is really important is that we're going to talk about some tables that I think are very, very critical for your understanding of some of this context. We're going to be talking about attestation. And I think there are 2 tables that you should spend plenty of time making sure you know. First of these is on A32, and this is a report type table. So this actually lists out the 3 types of engagements that you can perform in an attestation engagement. And we talked about this back in 417. We also talked about this in seminar. This is going to be examination, review, and agreed upon procedures. Now, just for context, an examination is basically an audit. It's that level of assurance. It's reasonable assurance. A review is kind of in the middle. It's less stringent than an audit, and is a little bit less assurance that you provide. We'll see that in a second. And the agreed upon procedures is very, very low assurance, or I should say no assurance for the most part. There are situations where you can provide some assurance, but for the most part, it's very minimal work. Okay, these scale down based on the way we're going to work. Examination, very, very thorough. Review, somewhat thorough. Agreed upon procedures, not really thorough at all. The reason I bring this table up is that there are 6 types of attestation services, and they list out the different types of services based on the exam or the engagement that you perform. Now, just as a context, you did not. This is not a typo here. You can perform agreed upon procedures to perform agreed upon procedures. Okay, that's basically just agreed upon procedures. It's both a service and an examination type. But there's also other types of services you can perform agreed upon procedures engagements. Okay, I keep saying examination type. I mean engagement type here. All right, so that's the first table that you should spend plenty of time looking at. This will make things very easy for you when you get to questions about attestation engagements. The other one is related to this one. It's on page 43. And this actually tells you, based on the type of engagement, what's the assurance level, the results, and what they're similar to. Okay. This one should come pretty intuitive after actually you understand this. But examination, as I said before, it's reasonable assurance. It's basically an audit. The positive assurance statement, it's the highest level of assurance that we can obtain as a CPA. Review is limited or negative assurance. That's basically saying we're not aware of any material modifications that are necessary. That is not as strong a statement, and it's not nearly stringent in testing. And the agreed upon procedures, no assurance provided. They're very, very minimal in scope. The type of result that's listed in examination is exactly the same as an audit. We issue an opinion. When we talk about the result for a review, they issue a conclusion, and that there's not really, I think we as human beings, we would use opinion and conclusion synonymously, but in audit vernacular, opinion and conclusion mean 2 different things. We issue a conclusion, not an opinion, and that will come up in one of the questions. Okay, an opinion is distinct from a conclusion. That conclusion is less severe. It's less imperative. That's basically meant to convey a limited opinion, okay, or sorry, limited assurance. I use the word opinion and I didn't mean to. Limited assurance as opposed to reasonable assurance. And then there's no opinion issued or no conclusion issued in agreed upon procedures. It's just called a list of findings. Or as I think I called it back in 417, a summary of findings, either one you want to talk about. All right, so moving on from that, let's go ahead and start talking about a few attestation questions. 2449. All right, CPA public practice is required to comply with the provisions of statements on standards for attestation engagements when doing what? This is a very simple matter of knowing what the types of services that you can perform are. And there were a list of those 6 that I talked about. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and really quickly, so I think it's 32. Going back and making sure you know what those services are. Okay, so agreed upon procedures, prospective financial statements, pro forma financial statements, compliance, NDA, service organization. I feel pretty confident I could have gotten those, just memorized those. That's how long I've been teaching stuff. All right, so 6 of them. All right, so we're looking for those 6 up here. All right, testifying as an expert witness in accounting auditing matters given stipulated facts. Is that one of those items listed? The answer is no. Okay, so we've got no as our first answer. Compiling the client's financial projection that presents a hypothetical course of action. Now, a compilation is a service that a CPA can perform, but not under statements on standards for attestation engagements. It will be, as we see, under statements on standards for accounting and review services. But this is specifically saying on SSAEs, the answer to this is also no, so D is our answer. All right, 4360. All right. This one is a CPA author question, but it's such a silly question. I do want to make sure that we just delineate this because it's a silly question, but I do think it conveys an important concept. A practitioner reporting on pro forma financial information does not possess an understanding of the client's business and industry in which the client operates. The practitioner should take which of the following actions? Now, that clue that I gave you earlier said, well, let's put this in the context of the audit. What would I do if I was an auditor here? Does not really hold here, okay? Simply because we're talking about reporting on pro forma financial information. That is not an audit. Reporting on pro forma financial information is going to be a far step back from that. They're just basically providing a report on pro forma financial information. But the question is, let's say that you were engaged to go into an industry that you knew nothing about, okay? So we'll take an industry that nobody knows anything about, oil and gas accounting. I mean, seriously, has anybody ever seen oil and gas accounting? Makes 0 sense, okay? I say this as somebody who audited for oil and gas accounting for 2 years. I still don't understand it, all right? And I probably shouldn't make that statement out loud because they say, hey, let's go back and look at these audits this guy worked on and see if there was any statements. I'm assuming the partner on charge of the audit knew a lot more about it than I did. Anyway, you're an audit, you get hired, or you're an auditor, you get hired to, or not auditor, you're a CPA, you get hired to provide services regarding pro forma financial information. So forward-looking information. What do? You don't have an understanding of the information. The simplest answer to this question is you gain an understanding of this information, okay? That's basically how I approach that question, is that before you even look at the answers and say, well, if I don't have an understanding, I should get an understanding. And that's basically the answer that we're looking for here. Now, if we were in an audit context, I do not think that this would be appropriate. I don't think that we could say, well, we're going to gain an understanding as soon as possible simply because we want to take on this audit. Is it possible that you do it, or is it hypothetically possible? Answer is yes, okay? Especially say, for example, that you're one of the few auditors in a particular area. Like say you're an auditor in Kirksville, Missouri, and they hire you on because they let go of another firm that was already in the area. There aren't that many firms in Kirksville that can do this type of work. So maybe it's required that you would actually have to gain an understanding to do the work because they can't feasibly hire anybody else. So that's a possibility. But for the most part, I would assume auditors would be hired based on their existing knowledge in certain areas. If you go to an auditor website, you can actually go online and look up any auditor, and they will actually list out the different industries that they feel expertise in. That's something that's pretty commonplace for most auditors nowadays. Talking about large accounting firms, they have expertise in all areas for the most part. Okay, go back to this question. What will we do to pro forma financial information? The answer is we're going to gain some information. How do we do that? We don't issue a disclaimer. We don't refer to it for a CPA. We don't perform a ratio analysis. We review industry trade journals, which is a rather unsatisfying question, a rather unsatisfying answer, but it is the most direct answer to the point that we're trying to reach, saying get information about it. Now, again, I don't think that you'll find something this simple or this straightforward on the CPA exam, but I do think it's important context to keep in mind is that when you look at a question like this, make sure you have an expectation for the answer, and then align your answer with the most reasonable answer to the response to what your expectation is. All right, let's talk about agreed upon procedures real quick. It's 1.5.08. Which of the following components is appropriate in a practitioner's report on the results of applying agreed upon procedures? All right. So this is saying is appropriate. So a practitioner's report of agreed upon procedures. Now, keep in mind, this goes back to that table on page 43. And we'll go ahead and go back to that table. I'm assuming that you haven't memorized this table yet, but if you have, good for you. Agreed upon procedures provides no assurance, and the result is not an opinion or conclusion, it's a list of findings. Basically, it's just saying, here's what we found over the course of our work. Do with this what you want. We're not trying to make any implications here. We're not trying to make you believe anything. This is just what we found. That's basically what agreed upon procedures is. So keeping that context in mind, let's go through the answers. Let's go through each of the answers. A title that includes the phrase independent audit. Do we audit during agreed upon procedures? The answer is no. We can eliminate A. The statement that management is responsible for expressing an opinion. Now, this is wrong in both two ways, okay? So first of all, we don't express an opinion on agreed upon procedures. Secondly, management never expresses an opinion. I guess that's not true. They would express an opinion on internal control if it was an issue or entity and they were testing or responsible for testing controls. But very rarely will management issue an opinion, so it wouldn't actually be management issuing an opinion. Nobody's issuing an opinion. A description of the procedures, forms, related findings, and description of any specific materiality threshold established reporting expectations. Now, we really didn't talk about a summary of findings or a list of finding means, but if I were to say, what looks like a list of findings to you? Does that look like a list of findings? Sure looks like a list of findings to me. That's our answer, by the way, but let's go to D to make sure. Statement the practitioner acknowledged that the procedures performed are appropriate for this specific purpose. That was not listed as close as one item that we include there, so we don't need to worry about that. So the closest thing to a list of findings is going to be C, all right? That's going to be the item that we're going to list. All right. You guys wanted sock, didn't you? You were raving for sock. Let's do sock. Okay. Except for those of you who don't like sock. For those of you, I'm going to apologize for the next couple minutes. All right. Payroll data company. By the way, funny story about this. I'm going to get a drink. You may ask, why are the company names on Becker and the Becker review and the CPA exam so boring? Fact and point, the AICPA deliberately makes them boring because they do not want people getting distracted by the names of the companies. So they actually just make up one of the most bland, boring names they can. And so this is kind of an example. A payroll data corp, a company that's doing payroll, they don't have anything specific, which is kind of contrary to what I do on my exams, on my auditing exams. You know, I always tease other people and I always make up names of faculty, which is probably distracting. I probably should stop that practice, but on the CPA exam, they will be boring and you will be bored by the names. And they do that deliberately. I listen to a podcast and they talked about that because I listen to CPA podcasts. Yeah. All right. Payroll Data Corp processes payroll transactions for a retailer. So they are a system and organization provider. Okay. So service organization provider. Coach CPA is engaged to express an opinion on the description of PDC system and the suitability of the design of PDC's internal controls placed in operation at a specific date. Now, this is a really important statement. This is a really important phrase. If you had a highlighter, this is one that you'd want to highlight through because this actually gives you context for the question. They are reporting on the suitability of the design only. All right, the design only. Now let's hold that. We're going to come back to that. These controls are relevant to the retailer's internal controls, so Cook report may be useful in providing the retailer is independent auditor with the information necessary to provide a financial statement. Cook's report should do what? Now, just remember that when we're talking about this from audit, we're talking about system and organization controls reporting, by the way. There's 5 different types of these. For the audit section, you will need to know one type of report, okay, or one category of report. That's SOC 1. That's it. You don't need to know SOC 2, SOC 3, SOC for cybersecurity, SOC for supply chain. You just need to know SOC 1. SOC 1 is specifically related to internal controls over financial reporting, and it has 2 types. The first type is a type 1 report, and the type 1 report says that they are reporting on the design of controls only at a specific point in time. Okay. The delineation from that is a type 2 report. A type 2 report reports, it's more substantial in scope. It reports on both the design and operating effectiveness over a period of time. All right. By the way, the type 2 report provides a great deal more assurance, but it's also more expensive because a lot more is required of it. Now, the reason I mentioned this is, remember I said highlight that one sentence. Cook CPA is hired to do a SOC 1 type 1 report by definition of that first one, because it says the suitability of design. If it was a type 2 report, it would have said design and operating effectiveness. Okay. So make sure you write down in your notes that it's like this is a type 1 report. So how do we answer this question based on that knowledge? Okay. So in this particular situation, it says Cook's report should do what? Identifies PDC's controls relevant to specific financial statement assertions. Okay. That is a correct statement. That would be something that we want to do as part of our examination of controls. Disclose Cook's assessed level of control risk for PDC. That's also a correct statement. They can make an assessment. Sorry, that's not a correct statement. Otherwise, sorry. This would be it's the correct statement if we were talking about, I got confused when I was talking about. So A is not a correct statement, B is not a correct statement. This would be correct if we were doing detailed testing of controls, which would require testing operating effectiveness. So I apologize. That would be correct, but it's not correct in just the assessment of controls, the design of controls. Contain a disclaimer opinion on the operating effectiveness of TPDC's controls. Now we're in the ballpark, okay? So what did I say? This is a type 1 report. Type 1 report reports only on design, not on operating effectiveness. So there's no opinion going to be rendered on the operating effectiveness because they did not do testing over that. If there's no opinion rendered, they're not issuing an opinion. By definition, disclaimer opinion. There's that terminology again I was warning about, okay? So don't get confused. Don't say, oh, that's an opinion type. No, in this situation, it literally means that they're not issuing an opinion on operating effectiveness. Why? Because they were not engaged to test operating effectiveness of controls. So C is our answer. I apologize for A and B. I got a little bit carried away. And then state whether PDC is specifically designed to teach the readers of objectives. They do not need to actually include that in the report. They would probably want to establish that, but they do not need to include that report. So clear depiction right there is going to be C. Again, the key to most of these questions in this area is making sure that you have a clear, distinct understanding of the difference between SOC 1 type 1 reports and SOC 2 type 2 reports and when they're going to be used. All right. Got some stuff on compliance. All right, so I want to talk really quick on compliance. So this always comes up and it's a little bit confusing. So the questions in Becker are going to cover compliance in two different categories. And I think it's important to understand the distinction between these two categories. So the first one is going to be, and we're going to see a question on this, is going to be compliance in connection with an audit, with audited financial statements. All right, now remember, compliance by definition means that an organization follows laws and regulations. And very frequently, a client will hire a firm to perform a compliance engagement in connection with a financial statement audit, which basically means it's the same person or same entity doing the financial statement audit and doing the compliance testing, which makes sense because if you're doing a financial statement audit, you have a lot of information about your client. Now, the important thing to note here is when we're talking about a compliance in connection with a financial statement audit, that will always result in a statement of negative assurance. It is basically a review. Okay, it's basically a review when we talk about compliance in connection with an audit. So think about it, when you see the words compliance in connection with a financial statement audit, the very first thing that should pop in your head is that, okay, this is negative assurance. It effectively resembles a review. All right. The really important reason this is a distinction has to do with the types of compliance engagements that are not in connection. If it's an examination of compliance or if it's a standalone compliance engagement, then that means that it's going to be a reasonable assurance that's going to be required. So again, distinct difference, okay? Compliance in connection with an audit, that is going to be limited assurance. An examination of compliance, by definition, an examination provides reasonable assurance. So make sure when you see the words compliance, you're understanding, okay, is this in conjunction with a financial statement audit, or is this a standalone examination of financial or of compliance proceedings? If it's a standalone engagement, then it needs to be a reasonable assurance. If it's in conjunction with financial statement audit, it's a review, basically. It's a negative assurance. All right. So I wanted to start that out so we can actually answer this next question, 4748. Which of the following factors is an auditor least likely to consider when reporting on compliance with aspects of contractual agreement in connection with audited financial statements and according with statements on auditing standards. All right, so what does this mean? Okay, what does this mean? Is it's saying we're going to actually test compliance, and we're testing compliance in connection with a financial statement audit. Now, what did I just say? That's very similar to a review, and it's going to have consistency with the review. Okay, it's going to be negative assurance testing. So let's go ahead and go through the answers. All right, let's go ahead and go through the answers. The appropriate opinion rendered in the compliance engagements. Sorry. I guess I should probably make sure we have this clear out. Okay. Which of the following factors the auditor least likely? Usually I italicize this, but we kind of mentioned over it. So we're talking about what is the auditor least likely to do in this particular scenario. The appropriate opinion to render in the report on compliance with respect to aspects of the contractual agreement. Okay. So it's saying, what is something that an auditor needs to consider in this scenario? Would they consider the appropriate opinion to render? What do y'all think? This is a really, really tricky answer. So the reason why is because, remember, a compliance in connection with a financial statement audit is similar to a review. It does not issue an opinion, it issues a conclusion. It's negative assurance. So A is our answer. And the reason why is because this is in conjunction with a financial statement audit. It is not a simple conclusion to come to. It's not a simple, didn't do that intentionally. It's not a simple answer to come to. But if you know that an opinion cannot be rendered with this type of engagement, then you can say, all right, I should ignore the one that says opinion. So what are we going to consider? What else? The opinion rendered in the audit financial statements, an opinion will be rendered in the financial statements, and that's going to be something that we would consider as part of the compliance engagement because that gives us information about our testing. So B is fine. The users of the audit report on compliance, that's definitely something that the CPA should consider. Whether the applicable covenants have been subjected to audit procedures as part of the financial statement audit. So they're looking at a contract. They're trying to make sure what are the terms of contract. Were these tested as part of the financial statement audit? If so, we can get information about that. So that will be something that I would do as part of the compliance engagement as well. So the only thing that makes any sense to eliminate is A, and that's because we do not issue an opinion. And even it says right here, negative assurance, not an opinion, may be rendered in engagement, which audits reporting on compliance aspects of contractual engagement. Okay. So negative assurance is basically that conclusion that we talked about before. Is that a trick question? Yeah, probably. But again, it does belie an important distinction that that we do need to make sure the difference between compliance in connection with a financial statement audit and a standalone compliance engagement or examination. All right. Let's go ahead and jump back to the book real quick. I want to show you something. So this is something that comes up a lot with respect to governmental auditing. Now, I know that this is going to be a little bit dicey. The good news is there is not a lot of questions on generally accepted governmental auditing standards. So I do think that it's really important for this area of the CPA exam to spend some time on this passkey. And there's a reason, because it's a passkey. Talks about one of the most tested features related to government audits, the requirement that a written report on internal control be prepared. The content of the report is frequently tested as well. So I would make sure that you have a passing familiarity with the content of the report. So it's going to be association or assertion, the value of compliance, assertion the controls related to financial reporting considered, indication that no weaknesses were found or significant deficiencies were found, indication of deficiencies of material. Now, this actually leads to an important item that comes up a lot on the CPA exam. You'll hear this, okay? They talk a lot about internal control with respect to governmental audits. And it sure sounds like, based on this information, that it's very, very stringent. This is not as stringent as a financial statement audit under issuer guidelines, PCAOB guidelines. Nowhere in here does it talk about an opinion being rendered on internal control. There will be a report on internal control issued under governmental auditing standards, but they do not issue opinions, okay? This is something that I think is probably something they should have included in the passkey, and maybe somewhere else, okay? It's important to note that they do not render an opinion over internal controls. And if I actually say it on your bottom, financial statement audit guidance requires a report on internal controls or financial reporting, not a report on internal controls or compliance, okay? So this is actually a distinction between internal controls over compliance versus internal controls over financial reporting, I offer, okay? So another little passkey. But regardless of the internal control report, they do not render an opinion on that. So if you see internal control in a governmental audit, you may have an inside shot on that just by saying, well, I know no opinion rendered, so that's what I'm looking for. All right, let's go ahead and go back to the questions. I think that's relevant to this, but let's see. Yeah, 6034. A report of internal control over compliance will include which of the following assertions? Now, ignoring the word assertion being issued. This is not assertion when we talk about management assertions. I think they probably should have used a different term. Let's go ahead and change that last word to assumptions, okay? Because that's an easier word, because that assertion, when used in audit context, means something very specific, and I don't like the fact that they used it just kind of willy-nilly. So, disclaimer of opinion in the event that significant weaknesses are identified. What do you guys think? Is this something that that we would include in internal control over compliance? So we would issue a disclaimer of opinion, but not that that significant weaknesses are identified. We just issue a disclaimer opinion, full stop. So A seems close, but let's continue on and see if there's a better answer. Identification of material weaknesses in the event that an adverse opinion is expressed, okay? So there's no adverse opinion is going to be expressed, so that won't actually be an issue, so we can eliminate B. And if either way, internal controls are adequate to provide reasonable assurance that an organization will comply in all material respects to the rules and regulations, no opinion is rendered, so we don't have to issue that. A disclaimer opinion on internal control over compliance. So there's a difference between A and D. D says we only issue a disclaimer opinion if significant weaknesses are identified, okay? D says we don't issue an opinion at all, which is most consistent with what we were just talking about. D, we don't issue an opinion at all. It doesn't matter what the context of the report on internal control means. It doesn't matter what the results of the testing were. There's no opinion rendered in a GAGAS audit, okay? No opinion rendered on internal control. So that's an important distinction to make. Again, does it seem like a trick question? Probably so, but it's really important. It underpins a really important concept of governmental audits. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about statements on standards for accounting and review services. We're moving to module 6 now. I'm going to do a few questions on module 6, and we're going to take a quick break. 8284. All right. So remember, on statements on standards for accounting and review services, we have 3 engagement types. We have preparation, compilation, and review. Now, when we talk about review under SSARS, I do want to make a distinction. There's both review under SSAEs and reviews under SSARSs. And the characteristics of those tend to be very, very similar. They both present negative assurance, okay? They both limited in scope. The big difference usually is when we talk about reviews under SSARSs, they specifically relate to reviews of financial statement audits. Or reviews of financial statements, not financial statement audits. Reviews of financial statements. We're going to get a little bit into that. We're going to talk about reviews here in just a little bit, but we'll save that for just a second. So under SSARSs, let's go ahead and make a distinction. Preparation is pretty straightforward. Preparation is saying, what is the framework that I'm trying to present? Is it GAAP? Is it tax basis? Is it cash basis? What is the basis that I'm preparing financial statements? And the CPA basically puts together the financial statements based on that framework. So they follow the rules of whatever it is. How does that differ from a compilation? A compilation is effectively the same thing, except a compilation includes management representations. So say that there are estimates that are being made by the company. The CPA includes the management estimates and the management points being made. So if there's something the CPA can't project on their own, they will require management to do that. That's the big difference between a preparation and compilation. The compilation includes management representations. And then a review, as I said before, a review is basically just kind of review this information. It's less in scope than an audit. Substantially less in scope than an audit. That's actually the terminology that's used. An accountant compiles unaudited financial statements that are not expected to be used by a third party. The accountant may decline to issue a compilation report provided what? So there's actually some information in the book about this, but let's just go ahead and quickly review the information that you're going to have to know about this. So when we talk about preparation, compilation, and reviews, they have some distinguishing features. So the first thing has to do with whether independence is required, okay? Second thing has to do with whether a report is required. And the third thing has to do with whether an opinion is issued, okay? Or a conclusion, I guess I probably should say, because the conclusion would be more appropriate in this context, all right? So for a preparation, none of the above, okay? None of the above. There's no independence requirements. There's no report issued, and there's no opinion rendered, Okay, no assurance being issued, no attestation being made. By the way, that's something that I talked about back in 417, but I probably shouldn't talk about this because Becker likes to throw this about. When they start talking about statements on standards for accounting and review services, so SSARSs, they like to use the term attestation function for whenever reporting occurs, and assurance function whenever an opinion is rendered. So if you see attestation and assurance being bandied about under SSARS, attestation or attest just basically means that they're issuing a report. Assurance basically just means they're issuing an opinion. Okay, so providing attest, providing assurance. All right, compilation. Compilation, independence is not required. However, there's a big caveat here. If you are not independent when you're performing a compilation, you do have to disclose that information in your report. And the only reason I bring that up is because that occasionally comes up on the CPA exam because it's a big exception, okay? It's like, all right, we don't have to be independent. You can prepare compilations for a third party without independence, but if you're not independent, that has to be included in the report, which probably leads to the second point, very, very importantly, a report is required. You can't issue an opinion in the report if you don't have a report, or sorry, issue a statement or report. But an opinion is not required, okay? So independence is not required with the big but there, okay? A report is issued, an opinion is not rendered, okay? The review is all three of the above are required. A review does require independence, it does require a report, and it requires a conclusion, which is a form of an opinion, okay? Because to use that term conclusion, we talk about review opinions. All right. So the question here, an accountant may decline to issue a compilation report provided. Well, what did I just say? Is a compilation report required? So under compilations, our reports required, because remember we said independence is not required, an opinion is not required, but a report is required. Full stop. I didn't throw you any exceptions out there. I didn't say a report's not required in this situation. A report's not required in this situation. I didn't give you any exceptions, did I? And there's a reason for that. There are no exceptions. Okay, there are no exceptions. The answer is no, no, no. Which is an aggravating question because it sure seems like a trick question. But again, this underpins a very important concept that we need to know. When is a report required for compilation? The answer is always. The answer is always. I guess if the accountant suffers a severe heart attack and is in the hospital and has to give the engagement to somebody else, I guess they don't have to issue a report then. You're just trying to fight for your life in that situation. That's really dark and morbid. I can't believe you guys mentioned that. That's just awful. That's just awful. Where are your heads, guys? Where are your heads? Let's go through compilation questions and then we're going to take a quick break. 4427. The standard compilation report on financial statements of a non-issuer that emits substantially all disclosures. So, okay, we've issued a compilation and the financial statements are presented, they're compiled, but they don't have any disclosures in them. Now, for the most part, we would assume under most reporting frameworks, disclosures are required, okay? So this is something that's probably problematic for us as a ZPA when we're in the report saying, well, this is probably a required part of the financial statements, but the financial statements do not have that. We were not given that information. Because again, a disclosure is a management representation. That's information used to support the information in the financial statements. Management's not explained the information in the financial statements, so we didn't do a full compilation. Now, what would be some logical steps that we want to go? So we want to include a paragraph disclosing such emissions, okay? Answer is, yeah, probably that makes sense because those would probably be required there. Let's go down to 3. State that the admitted disclosures were included, they might influence the user's conclusions, all right? Would that be something that we would include in the report? The answer is yes. And without seeing this, you probably wouldn't know that, but that would make sense, okay? If they had disclosures, those would change the context of the financial statements. So 1 and 3 are completely and totally sensible. And by the way, you know that one of these has to be required because every single answer has 1 or 3 in it, okay? So I can't leave you that one thing where none of the above is a possibility because none of the above is not a possibility, which gives you a clue that these are going to be required. The issue then is if 1 and 3 make sense, does 2 make sense? Would it include a disclaimer of opinion? And again, that's one of those situations where they're using disclaimer opinion as the literal meaning. We do not issue an opinion. The answer is that would be included as well. So all 1, 2, and 3 would be included in this scenario. Does that make sense? Okay. I don't like the number 2. 1 and 3 were the ones that were really important to talk about, but 2 is kind of one of those things that we've talked about many, many times. And you say, Dr. Barnes, we get it. Disclaimer opinion means no opinion. You don't have to repeat it over and over again. Okay, fine. I won't do it anymore. I won't do it anymore, except for this next question. County's compilation report of the underfinancial statements of the non-issuer should disclaim an opinion on the financial statements. Does everybody understand why that's important now? I threw in one last question just to be snarky, okay? We're not gonna spend a lot of time on question on that. But basically, again, remember, no opinion being issued effectively means the same thing as disclaimer opinion. By the way, when you sit for the CPA exam, you're gonna hear those words in my head. You're gonna say, if I just disclaim a disclaimer of opinion, I know that means no opinion is being rendered. Use that literally. Use that literally. All right. Last question before break. 8188. The accountant compiles the financial statements of a non-issuer and issues a standard compilation report. Although not specifically stated in the report, it is implied that, well, what did we just say 2 questions ago? We said that if disclosures were not included, then we need to make statements to that effect. Is that correct? We didn't say the disclosures are not included, and if these disclosures had been included, they probably would have changed your understanding of the report. So if that statement only comes, those statements only come up if disclosures are excluded, then implicitly speaking, we don't put those statements in if the disclosures are included. So substantially all disclosures required by GAAP are included in the financial statements. That sure sounds like a good answer. Let's go through the rest of the answers to see what's going on. Compilation is limited to presenting information that is a representation and management. Well, that's actually a statement that comes in, that's actually a direct statement in the compilation report, which you wouldn't know that without looking at the compilation report, but that's actually an explicit statement made. The financial statement should not be used to obtain credit. Let's answer this question. This one seems very interesting. Why would we prepare a compilation report? What's the purpose of that? Why would a client ask us to do a compilation for them? What will be one of the key reasons? Well, they need financial statements. Why do companies provide financial statements? Is to provide assurance about their operations. Remember, we talked about this back in the time. Financial accounting, the whole goal of financial accounting is basically to provide a financial statement so that external stakeholders can actually understand what's happening with the internal operations organization. In general, we talked about that from an owner perspective, but could be other parties. Could they have an interest in the financial operations of an organization? Like if a bank is going to issue a loan, would they want to know what kind of company that they're getting involved with? Financial statements would probably be very good in that context. I would say that compilations would be a big reason, or sorry, that obtaining loans would be a big reason for a compilation. Because the bank may say, can you compile the financial statements for us so we can have an understanding of what this organization looks like to make our decision about whether to issue a loan? That would be a big reason to do that. I would say that seems ridiculous to say they cannot use this to obtain credit. Okay. There is a lot of scenarios that I would use that. The accountant is not audited or reviewed the financial statements. Now, again, this is like B. That is a correct statement, but that is an explicit statement. That is an explicit, that's something that's specifically said in the report itself. So the only thing that's not included explicitly is substantially all disclosures required by GAAP are included in the financial statements. So again, you do need to take a look at the report example itself to know that these are straightforward statements. I will say it's a very simple report. You don't need to memorize it. You just need to understand the important components. All right, let's take like a 5-minute break. All right, so I'm gonna give you one last story. Let's save the best for last. So this is 2018. This is Dr. Otera's capstone class. Back then in the capstone class, the way that we had the capstone project set up is that every single faculty member served as an advisor for the capstone projects, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. I enjoyed it because I got to work directly with students on certain topics. It was a lot of work, and basically my spring breaks were always taken up during the spring, and my fall breaks because we were doing evaluations of drafts. We've changed it since then because a lot of the faculty members were just kind of stressed out and had a lot of work. But, you know, I had some really, really fun topics. I did a lot of gamification topics that I really, really enjoyed. And so I was sitting in the capstone presentation as Dr. Davis was, because the capstone course was his baby, and he's the one who created that. And by the way, just so you understand the professional context, is that we frequently traded barbs that were not professional at all. We were good friends, but we could actually exchange those. And we did them publicly, which is probably not very professional, but he called me an ugly auditor. I called him an old tax attorney. And you know, that was kind of the system. So we're in class, and one of Dr. Shoney's students is actually presenting on tax avoidance. Okay. And so Alan hated topics about tax avoidance. He just basically said, if it's legal, it's not avoidance. Okay, it's something that's prescribed as a law. He just basically he didn't think it should be subject to ethical interpretation. So he actually posed this question to the students. Okay. So let's say 10 years from now, you're a partner in an accounting firm making $300,000 a year, and I'm doing your taxes. Are you going to be more concerned with paying as little in tax as possible, or are you going to be focused on morality? And so it was a really unfair question. I actually remember the student who did it. Well, it's an interesting question, but I think that he kind of was trying to shortcut it and say, yeah, you're just going to be trying to save as much as possible. You're going to be following the law. And so, Al, I thought that was a very unfair question, Alan. So I followed up with this question and say, Alan, you said you'll be doing your taxes in 10 years. If that's the case, I want to ask, are Ouija boards tax deductible? And the class just went crazy. The class went nuts. And Kathy rolled her eyes. Alan kind of fumed about it. And that's not the end of the story. So he drops by my office the next day. This is the worst, by the way. I'm going to tell you, you guys are going to think I'm a horrible person. And that's a fair statement when you hear about it. So he stops in my office the next day and he says, my capstone comment was extremely unprofessional. He's doing it more in a joking manner because he knows that I do tease stuff like that. But I decided to have a little fun with him. And so I said, I'm sorry, Alan, I really need to keep my comments under control. It's like I'm always telling my mom, and then here's what I do with my mom sometimes. It's like I'm always telling my mom, and my mom hates it when I do that. Alan just went, what? So yeah, I'm a really bad person. So I expect to have that act counted against me at St. Peter's, but tells me where I spent my $100. It was worth it. Yeah, I'm still going to tell that story. All right. I'm really sorry you guys never got to know Alan Davis. He was a character.
I feel like we got to know him through you.
Yes. And someday Dr. Caden will be telling these stories about me and say, this is a ridiculous character known as Dr. Barnes. Yes.
He's still in Kirksville, isn't he?
Yeah, he's still in Kirksville, yeah.
I was about to say, so Martha Sykes, she works at Hard Cummins most of the time. And she's like, yeah, I had Alan Davis.
Yeah. And she can tell the stories because she was there right around the end of the time. But yeah, I tell you right now, the stories don't do justice. He's just as a ridiculous character as I make him out to be. You know, you think there's nobody that could be possibly that insane. No, that man was. And that's just scratching the surface. All right, let's do some stuff on reviews. I do think it's worthwhile making sure that you look at 28. There's an acronym here. It's called You Liar CPA, which is one of my favorite Becker acronyms, but it talks about the requirements applicable to review. I think if you memorize these acronym components, that you should feel pretty good about what you know to review. So keep in mind, this is specifically a review of financial statements under our statements on standards for accounting and review services. These will not apply to SSA reviews because SSA reviews are more general. They can cover anything, not just financial statements. These are statements on standards for accounting and review services. Now, there will be some clarification for that because it's going to get really, really weird here in just a second when we start talking about the different categories of reviews. But for right now, looking at this and understanding these, I think will be beneficial for you. One thing that's important to note, this comes up a lot. The IA in LIAR says inquiries and analytical procedures. In general reviews, we do not perform the same type of test work we perform in audit. The exception to that is they will perform inquiries and they will perform analytical procedures to try to gain information about the organization. That's it, okay? If you see confirmations, if you see inspection of tangible assets, if you see reperformance, none of those are performed in a review, okay? Just inquiries and analytical procedures. I guess technically speaking, you could say that inspection records and documents would be included as well, but that's kind of a given that the review is going to be performed on accounting records. So technically speaking, you could say 3, but they don't really include the inspection records and documents, as I think that's going to be assumed to conclusion. All right, so where was I at? 11061. All right. Which of the following procedures does the CPA usually perform when reviewing the financial statements of a non-issuer performed in accordance with statements on standards for accounting and review services? Make inquiries of management concerning restrictions on availability of cash balances. Well, we just said inquiries were one of the testing procedures. So that's probably our answer. But let's go ahead and let's move through the rest. Communicate deficiencies in the design of internal control to the entity's audit committee. Now, it's important to note, this one is not in the acronym, but you will see it later in Becker. One of the big differences between reviews financial statements and audits of financial statements is we do not consider internal controls in reviews. Internal controls are not tested. I think that probably you should understand them, but they're not a required component of review testing. Examine trend analysis to determine the appropriateness assessment of CCMA's assessment of detection risk. Now, this is a little bit tricky one, okay? Because you're going to look at trend analysis, you're going to say that sounds like an analytical procedure, and it is, okay? The question is would we use analytical procedures for this purpose? First of all, we don't really need to worry about detection risk setting in this context. Secondly, we would not use an analytical procedure to determine the assessment of detection risk. Analytical procedures would be part as used as substantive procedures. So this is an inappropriate association. We don't actually use analytical procedures to determine the assessment of detection risk. That's not something that we would do in any context. So we can toss out C. Evaluation plans for dealing with negative trends and financial difficulties. That's not something that we have to worry about because that's a going concern opinion. It may come up over a course of review, but that's not something that we're required as part of the testing. So this is the most clear answer is A. All right, 3387. When unaudited financial statements are presented in comparative form with audited financial statements in a document filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, such statements should be what? Now, this is something important to note. Unaudited financial statements and comparative financial statements. First of all, comparative financial statements are what we're familiar with. Usually what happens is that in a financial statement presentation, especially for public companies, usually what happens is they don't present 1 year, they present years side by side for comparative purposes. So in the auditor's report, remember the statements is we have tested the balance sheets and income statement accounts for the years 2025, 2024, 2023. Usually we use 2 or 3 years, depending on the scope of procedures. Now, what happens if we have one of those financial statements that's audited and others that are unaudited? So what would the conclusion be? Well, the first easy answer is that such statements that are unaudited should probably be marked as unaudited, okay? So we can say that's a really easy conclusion to make because people who are using the financial statements. So this would come up, I guess I should probably back up. This would come up, say, for example, you've got a client that has not had an audit until the current year. So all their financial statements they prepared for previous years are going to be naturally unaudited. Does that mean that the CPA cannot reuse those? The auditor cannot use those in their presentation? The answer is sure they can use those, but they do have to take some precautions. First of all, those financial statements that are previous need to be marked as unaudited, okay? Secondly, withheld until audited. So if we're talking about previous year's financial statements, does it make sense for us as auditors of the current year to go back and audit previous years? Probably not. That's not what we were engaged to do, okay? So we don't need to withhold the audit report. We're only concerned about the audit report in the current year. Should they refer to an auditor's report? This one's a tricky one, okay? Should be referred to in the audit report? The answer is no, because they're not part of the audit, okay? They are unaudited. The only thing that we refer to in the audit report is anything that's audited. So while they're marked as unaudited, then we're not going to include them in the audit report, because remember the audit report specifically says we have audited for the periods, and then we would name the periods of audit, which would only be the current year. So that's the way to think about this. Yes, no, and no. I don't know why that had to do with reviews, but it's important to note. All right. So now let's talk about interim reviews. This is where things get a little bit tricky. All right. So this is going to come up. Sometimes you will have reviews that are standalone reviews of financial statements. Those are under statements on standards for accounting review services. You will also see terminology referring to interim reviews. Now, what an interim review is usually it's a review in conjunction with financial statement audits. So you got a large company, they have an annual financial statement audit, but they also have quarterly reviews or reviews of their quarterly financial statements. These are not audits, okay? They're less in scope, but they're performed on the financial statements that will be, the quarterly financial statements that will be used to compile into the audit. How do we approach those as auditors? And the answer is effectively the same way that we would approach the financial statement audit, okay? If it's a large public company that's having quarterly interim reviews, the reviews them, or sorry, quarterly and a large public company that's having quarterly reviews, the financial statement audit that takes place at the year end would be under PCAOB guidelines. The interim reviews would also be under PCAOB guidelines, and all the rules would be held to their, not saying that we would have to perform the same scope of testing procedures, but generally speaking, the rules for the reviews will be the same as the audit. They'll be PCAOB rules. we're talking about a non-issuer that has an annual financial statement audit, the audit itself would be under statements and auditing standards or the ASB guidelines, okay? The reviews will also be on statements and auditing standards or ASB guidelines, okay? So the way to think about this is, okay, this is where things get a little bit crazy because we got 4 different categories of reviews, okay? We've got reviews that are in conjunction with attestation engagements, SSAEs, okay? All right, those are very, very open-ended. We don't have any kind of specific guidelines on those other than the ones that we talked about on pages 32 and page 43 of A5. That's basically what you should focus on. We've got reviews of financial statements that are standalone. Those are SSARS, okay? Those are negative assurance. Those are the ones that have to be independent and you issue a conclusion on. We have reviews that are interim reviews of public company audits. Those are PCAOB guidelines. And then we have reviews of non-issuer companies that are in conjunction with an annual audit. Those are SAS guidelines. Is everybody thoroughly confused now? Now, this important point is to note is that there's a distinction between the reviews. The nature of the reviews themselves are very similar, with the exception of SSAEs. SAEs are really, really weird. But the nature of the reviews themselves are very similar. The important point to note is, what are the guidelines that we're following in each scenario? If it's an attestation engagement, it's SSAEs. If it's a standalone review, it's SSARS. If it's in conjunction with the audit, it's either going to be PCAOB for public companies or statements on auditing standards for private companies or for non-issuers, okay? That is the crux of noting all those items, is noting what are the standards that are relevant in that. The key to the last two is if you see the word interim review, that generally means that they're going to be performed in conjunction with a financial statement audit. So it's going to be PCAOB or SSAS guidelines. All right, with that large spiel, let's go to 4941. Which of the following is not the difference between a review of a public entity's interim financial information and a review of the unaudited financial statements of a non-issuer, okay? So which of the following is not a difference to a review of a public entity's interim financial information and a review of the unaudited financial statements of a non-issuer? Now, what does this mean, okay? Review of public entities' interim financial information is talking about an interim review. So we're talking about a review in conjunction with a financial statement audit. This one's talking about a standalone review, which would be statements on standards for accounting and review services. So we're trying to see what are the differences between here. Now, the easiest way to approach this is would this be something that's required under auditing standards for the first, but not under auditing standards for the second? Now, it's not a direct conclusion, but we're going to try to work with what's the most sensible, okay? So the guidance for the former is provided by PCAOB standards, where the latter is conducted in accordance with statements on standards for accounting and review services. That is a correct statement. That's not our answer because remember, we're saying we're not a difference. That is a correct statement. Because we're talking about public companies interim review. Remember, public entities, if they're doing an audit or a review in conjunction with audit, they follow PCAOB rules, okay? So PCAOB standards for the first, SSARS for the second. The former requires entities of the client can turn any litigation assessments while the latter does not, okay? Let's put a pin in that one. I want to come to that one because that's a little bit uncertain. We know that under an audit that we will require an inquiry of the client's attorney, but we're not sure about that for review. So we need to talk about that. The former requires recorded communication of the predecessor auditor, whereas the latter does not, okay? That is true, okay? Remember review, they were talking about that's less than scope. We're talking about audit, we would want to communicate with the predecessor auditor. So that's a true statement. The former requires an evaluation of internal control, the latter does not. This one's actually specific to PCAOB guidelines. Remember, PCAOB audits require a review of internal control. Okay, so we would actually say that's correct. Now, this one's one that you would only know by knowing the guidelines. So we're talking about clients or inquiry of attorneys in litigation for claims and assessments. This is not a requirement under either. It's very clear that this is not a requirement under statements on standards for accounting or review services because we know the rules for that. So that's the ULI or CPA acronym, which inquiry about litigation is not included in that. Even though it uses the word inquiry, okay, this is talking about inquiry of the management, not of external parties. Technically speaking, this would be a correspondence with an external party. They use the word inquiry to mislead you. The question is this required under PCAOB guidelines? The answer for an audit is yes. But when do we conduct this during an audit? Does everybody remember when we do that attorney communication? It's at the very end of the audit to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Okay, so this is a period point in time reference. This is something we only conduct at one point in time. Under reviews, we're not at that point in time. We're doing it at interim points, usually during quarters during the period. So there's no reason for us to actually point at that point in time. So we're trying to do a wrap up. So this is not required under reviews. This is not required under reviews of any context whatsoever. Now, I realize that that would have been a really difficult question to answer, but the whole point of this question is actually saying, make sure you understand the difference between reviews that are done in conjunction with a financial statement audit versus reviews that are standalone. Okay. Again, first one is going to be under the standards of whatever the audit is going to be conducted. In this case, PCOB, because it's a public entity. If we're a non-issuer, this would be SAS, Statements on Auditing Standards. The last one is done under Statements on Standards for Accounting Review Services because it is a standalone review. 5820. A CPA concludes the unaudited financial statements on what the CPA's disclaim and opinion are not in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles because management has failed to capitalize leases. The CPA suggests appropriate revisions to the financial statements, but management refuses to accept the CPA's suggestions. Under the circumstances, the CPA ordinarily would do what? All right. So this is an interesting question. Because in a normal scenario, if the management fails to follow these guidelines, then we would just say adverse opinion or qualified opinion, one of the two. But the question itself at the beginning has said, we are disclaiming an opinion. We are not rendering an opinion on these financial statements, okay? Not addressing the issue of the financial or an opinion on the financial statements. So what do we do, okay? What do we do in this situation? Well, let's just go ahead and do the answers and see what's the most likely. Now, this one's, again, one of those questions that I think some of the answers will be very, very clear. Some of the answers will be not so clear. So we restrict the distribution of the CPA's report to management entities and board of directors. So we're talking about issuers. We're talking about an issuer audit. That would make sense because remember, so it's not. We would not do this in an issuer audit because we would actually never have a situation where we would disclaim an opinion for unaudited financial statements. In this situation, it would have to be a non-issuer audit. The non-issuer has to be a broad stakeholder audience. So A cannot be a answer because it actually has to be a general distribution. Express limited assurance that no material modification should be made to the financial statements. If we're disclaiming an opinion, are we issuing any assurance anyway? Answer is no. If we're disclaiming an opinion, no assurance is being rendered. So we can't issue limited assurance because we're not issuing any assurance. Let's go to D. Issue a qualified opinion or adverse opinion depending on materiality, departure, or gap. That's the same as B. We're not issuing an opinion. We're not issuing assurance, so we can't change our opinion because we're not issuing an opinion. Okay. So C is the only one that leaves us to an opportunity. Describe the nature of the departure from gap in the CPA's report and state the effects on the financial statements and practice. That makes perfect sense. Okay. You're basically saying, look, we didn't audit these. We have no opinion on these. We should probably know that this is something we found and it may change your perception of the financial statements. And that is in fact our answer. All right. 6854. When planning a review and audit of clients' interim financial statements, which of the following procedures should the accountant perform to update the accountant's knowledge about the entity's business and system internal controls? So this is interim reviews. Again, this would be a review that's done in conjunction with the financial statement audit. All right. So what are some things that we would need to do? So first of all, very first thing, the word planning is really, really important here because we're talking about planning the review itself. Okay. This is a little bit different from planning phase because because the phases are not as well defined for review, but that word planning is really important. So what would be something that we would do as part of planning for an engagement? So we inquire the entity's outside counsel. Well, first of all, for review, we already know that we don't do any outside counsel inquiries. So we can eliminate that. Even if we didn't eliminate that, you can note this would not be something we would do in planning in any context. Okay. This would be at the end of the engagement. So like an example of material revenue transactions occurring to the interpreted and examined supporting documentation. Could we do that for an interim engagement? Possibly. Okay. We probably could examine supporting documentation because we can look at documentation. Will we do that as part of planning for the engagement? No, that's a test right there. Format analytical procedures. Okay. We can eliminate that as well. That's another form of testing. You need to look at the rest. Consider results of audit procedures performed with respect to the current year's financial statements. So that's something to think about. Would we want to look at the previous audit procedure, or previous audit procedures, and kind of use those to direct the course of the review? That makes perfect sense. Yes, that's something we could do as part of planning. All right, we're on our last category for the reviews. Okay, code of professional conduct. All right. Must a CPA in public practice be independent in mind and appearance when providing the following services? Oh, we've talked about this already. So what do we got? What do we got? Compilation of personal financial statements. What do you guys think? Do we need to be independent? Okay, no, but remember that compilation throws a caveat. We do not need to be independent, but we do have to disclose our lack of independence in the report. That's true for part of the third one too, because it also says compilation of financial forecast. That whole same rule holds true. Any compilation, no independence is required, but they have to disclose that. So we can say the first and third column are both no. Preparation of a tax return. Preparations do not require independence, no disclosure whatsoever. That's a flat no. So the answer is no, no, no. Wasn't that easy? All right. 5533. According to the ethical standards of profession, a CPA's independence most likely would be impaired if the CPA did what? Now, I haven't gone through all the rules on independence. There are a lot of them, but it's something a lot of these things are fairly intuitive. So let's go ahead and talk through these as we're going through this. Serve with a client's bank as co-fiduciary of a estate or trust. All right. So this one's kind of, the wording is really, really weird. But let's think about this. One of the concerns about independence is that you have a vested interest in a client. Okay. So in this situation, your bank is the client, or the bank here is the client that you do work for, probably an audit, something like that. All right. So you do audit work on the bank. So having a vested interest in the bank would be problematic. Does working as a co-fiduciary, so basically the kind of the executor of a estate or trust with the bank, does that impair your independence? The answer is no, because you are the executor of a separate estate that the bank is also an executive for. You are working together simultaneously on that trust, but neither one of you has a financial interest in that trust or one another. So that's going to be something we can say that's perfectly fine. Okay, you're working together on something separate on a third party, but neither one of you have a vested interest in one another. Contract with the client to supervise the client's office personnel. All right, so let's assume that you're working for a public, or you're working for an auditor, or sorry, an accounting firm. A company hires you to coordinate the internal audit function. That's one thing that a lot of really big public accounting firms do, is they outsource internal audit work. So the internal audit personnel of the client is actually your personnel. And then the auditor or the client says, we'd like you to perform the financial statement audit for our company. Whose work will you be auditing?
Your work.
Your own work. Yeah, you'll be auditing your own work. Now, we've talked about that. It's a little bit like grading your own exams. Okay. Do you think you could be independent in fact and appearance by grading your exams? I know you all are very honest, and probably in fact, you probably say, I probably give myself a worse grade than you give me, Dr. Barnes. That's how scrutinous I am on my work. That's true. Okay. So I have high regard for Truman's integrity, but would you be independent in appearance in that regard? Probably not. Okay. So B is probably our answer, but let's go to C and D. Became a member of a trade association of the client. Membership in trade associations is generally considered to be just fine. Okay. As long as there's no financial interest with one another, you can actually be a trade association agreement with a client. Accepted any gift from a client. Be very careful of absolute answers tend to never be the correct question. The gift threshold, I believe it's still $50. So there was an example that we're going to look at, and usually speaking, we talk about the gifts. There's going to be either an extreme or one of the others. So they're either going to be so extremely small that it's obvious it's not a violation of interest, or extremely large that it's obvious it is a violation of interest. But any gift, some gifts will be fine, some gifts will not be fine. It depends on the financial threshold. I do not think the CPA exam will say, okay, $51.50. Is that enough? Is that enough to violate? I don't think they're going to come to that guideline. But they will test this guideline. So B is our answer. All right, last multiple choice question, then we're going to do a quick task-based simulation. It's 24. Code of Professional Conduct's independence rule does not consider which of the following circumstances to be a lack of independence. So which of these is not a independence violation? The financial institution client loans the auditor money to buy a car. I'm already really suspicious on that, but does not collateralize the loan. This is a big difference. If the loan was collateralized, then basically it would be fine. Okay, the collateralization of the loan, because basically it means if the loan fails, then they recover the car. If the client institution fails, then you're going to be any peril. So the collateralization alone would be fine, but the collateralization alone does not exist. So if you're the auditor and you're like, oh, this bank is going under. If this bank goes under, then I lose my car. All right, I'm going to make sure this client bank gets a clean opinion, even if they're about to go out of business. So yeah, this would definitely be a violation. Audit provides valuation and appraisal services to the clients, the result of which are materials to the client's financial statements. This is just like providing entities or support services or personnel services. Whose work are you auditing in that situation? Your own work. That's a clear violation. The auditor's brother-in-law's father is the controller of the client being audited. Now, there's some very specific rules on individual parties. Okay, so if we're talking about related parties, we're talking about immediate family members. Those have a clear independence guideline. They basically have to follow the same independence rules that auditors do. Okay, and we're talking about immediate family members. That's going to be the client spouse or their partner or dependent children. All right. So spouse or partner, dependent children, those have to follow the, I think maybe it should be dependents actually. Yeah, any dependents. So if we're talking about close family members, then that's going to be parents, siblings, and non-dependent children. Close family members are not subject to the same stringent rules. It has to be a direct and material interest. Now you'll notice this says brother-in-law's father. So not only is it not a blood relative, but it's somebody who's a relative of a blood relative. Technically speaking, brother-in-law would not be a close enough family relative. Brother-in-law's father is certainly far enough away. Now, this came up in the last year. Somebody says, well, I was a brother-in-law and I was not allowed any engagement because they thought it was too close to interest. This is independence in fact. One thing that's important to note is that we also can consider independence in appearance. A brother-in-law, while not technically violating the rules of the Code of Professional Conduct, could actually be considered to be close enough to be a violation in appearance. I would say that specifically speaking, if it was somebody, because this is a student who was working as an intern, I said, well, they probably had plenty of interns they could replace you so that it was not a violation. It was not a very, very big ask. If you were the partner on the engagement and they had no other partners who could actually fill that engagement, then they probably would have said, okay, fine, you can work the engagement. But independent in fact and appearance, they try to be very, very, very clean about make sure that they are no material interest whatsoever. So C is our answer. Let's go with D. The CPA is solo auditor manager service control of the firm's audit client from the year January year 1 to May year 6. When the manager began working in the CPA firm, the current audit period for this client is April 1st, year 6 to the March 31st, year 1. So you'll notice that the audit period starts in April. The CPA did not, or the CPA manager did not leave the client until May. So they're going to be a month overlap where the audit or the CPA is going to be auditing their own work. And that cannot be used. I know that 1 month seems like that's ridiculous, Dr. Barnes. Come on. Maybe it's 2 months if you talked about the end of year. But 2 months, okay, that's only 1/6 of the year. They can audit that, right? No, they cannot. Okay, there cannot be any overlap. That's why we have the year cooling off period in our guidelines for roll around. All right, so C is our answer. Okay, let's do one task-based simulation, then we're done. Lotus, this one should be pretty familiar to you because we did this in seminar. All right. Jones and Associates CPAs were recently hired to perform an audit of financial statements of heavy metal construction. Okay, I do like that name. Use the information in the exhibits above to determine which of them not is a violation of the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. So in B, we're going to identify if it's a violation. So basically yes or no, no violation or no violation. And then if the rule is violated, we're going to say which rule. Now, I do want to note the way you should answer this question is if there's no violation, you leave this blank. For purposes of our content, I want to look through this and I want to say, all right, if there's, regardless of whether there's a violation, what is the rule that's relevant here? Okay. I pulled up my wrong document, so give me just a second. I need to pull up the correct document. Talk amongst yourselves. What is your favorite Code of Professional Conduct guideline? I've done this question so many times, I probably could answer this on my own, but I just want to be very thorough. You all have heard that. Okay, there we go. Didn't think it would take you that long. All right, so. Continuation of the use of the name Jones and Associate CPA. So let's go ahead and look at the HR memo to answer this question. So the HR memo says, Jones and Associate CPA is proud to announce that our 4th consecutive year, all our employees are members of the AICPA. All right, that's a very relevant piece of information. So to be a member of the AICPA, you either have to be a student working towards your CPA, or you have to be a CPA licensed in professional practice. Okay, so that's good to know. On a sad note, we're going to inform you that the founder of Jones and Associates CPA has passed away. Will continue to use the name Jones and Associates. So there's 2 issues here. Okay. First of all, does the name Jones and Associate require that you actually have to have somebody working there that name's Jones? Well, how many people think that Kleinfeld, Peet, Mark, and Girdler still have Kleinfeld, Peet, Mark, and Girdler working there? The Kleinfeld and Girdler actually died back in the 1950s. So I don't know about Peet, Mark. So a lot of those people have been passed away. Anderson, remember we talked about Anderson, Arthur Anderson passed away like in 1950 something. So yeah, there's no requirement that the actual name has to be somebody who's working there. That's not a requirement. It's the founder can actually retain the names. But the actual other part of the question is, so Jones and Associates is fine, but what about putting CPAs after the name? All right. Can you put CPAs after the name in this context? Well, if you're interested, it's interesting to note, if you look at the names, a lot of CPA firms do not have the word CPAs after it. What does that imply? It implies that anybody providing services for the firm have to be CPAs, or for services for clients have to be CPAs. So if every single person providing your services for clients is a CPA, then you can call yourself Jones and Associates CPAs. That's fine. Now, if somebody who's providing services is not a CPA, you are not legally allowed under the Code of Professional Conduct to actually use the term CPAs, because not everybody's a CPA. Now, there's an important distinction to make, okay? That does not mean that everybody working at the firm has to be a CPA. There's people who do service support, like administrative work or kind of IT work, something like that. If they do not directly provide services to the client, they do not have to be CPAs. But anybody providing direct service to the client do need to be CPAs. In this case, we're fine. Everybody there is going to be CPAs, so we say no violation. But let's go ahead and look at the rule that's actually being teched here. There's no violation here, but the rule that's relevant here, what do you guys think? By the way, these are all fairly intuitive for the most part.
Form organization.
Form an organization, new name rule. Yep, good job. All right. All right, HMC gift to the audit supervisor. I'm going to close this because we're going to open another one. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the email from the audit manager. We're going to be looking at this quite a bit. Okay. So if we go down in the email to the audit manager, it says, I think HMC is very happy with their work. This is how supervisor talks. The controller just gave me a $20 gift certificate to use for lunch at a local restaurant. So this is an interesting one. Is $20 enough to be construed as a violation? What do you think? So I used to eat at Chili's all the time back. I haven't eaten at Chili's forever, but yeah, I used to eat at Chili's all the time, and you could buy like a bloomin' onion for $20. No, it's not enough to be a violation. $20 does not exceed that threshold. Remember, we talked threshold was about $50. What is this going to be a violation of? What is the concern? Well, gifts generally fall under the independence rule. Okay. All right. Failure to return HMC's audit or HMC's receiving reports. Okay. So let's go ahead and so it says, I believe the audit staff is transferred to another location and me be like, well, when they responded, if you look at the auditor supervisor saying, I noticed you reviewed the return. HMC notified the audit staff has not returned receipt reports provided by the controller despite numerous requests. She said it's been 2 months since she initially requested the return of these documents. Despite numerous requests, the documentation neither returned nor any follow-up communication. Can please follow up and provide the controller with an update? All right. So basically what we have here is we have a scenario where the client has been saying for 2 months, give us back the receiving reports. It's our documentation. You can only have that for the audits. You can't have it for any longer. Okay. The audit has basically said nothing. All right. Is this a problem? Answer is absolutely. Okay. This is absolutely a problem. It's absolutely a violation. Now, which one is this a violation of? Okay. Which one is this a violation of? Does anybody know?
Would it be the accounting principles?
No. Well, we'll talk about accounting principles, but it's not that one. Do you remember, Lotus, which one it is? It is the acts discreditable rule. Okay. Acts discreditable rule. Now, here's an interesting point about this. action discreditable has a lot of different possible items that have been listed as part something could be an action discreditable for a CPA. However, on the CPA exam itself, I have never seen an example of action discreditable other than this specific example. Okay. Every single question I've seen on Becker and examples from the CPA exam all refer to this specific type of incident for action discreditable, a failure to return client information upon request. How prominent is this? If you go to ChatGPT or to Copilot and you actually do a search and say, what are the rules of the Code of Professional Conduct? I actually did this search a while back. It actually, instead of says action discreditable, actually specifically says failure to return client documentation is one of them. That's how prominent this rule is, that example is in this particular rule. So I do not think that you'll see an example of action discreditable other than this one. At least I've not encountered one. All right, non-GAAP depreciation method. Let's look at what's happened to say. All right. So the manager says, I noticed that US or HMC does not follow US GAAP with respect to depreciation. Can you explain? And the senior says, I discussed the non-GAAP method with the in-charge partner and HMC management. We determined that the company's method for depreciation was acceptable given the unique industry necessary for HMC to avoid misleading financial statements. So they're not following GAAP. Is that a violation of the Code of Professional Conduct? It is not. It is not a violation of Code of Professional Conduct. So why is that the case? Because generally accepted accounting principle specifically says if following GAAP would lead to material misleading information, you do not have to follow GAAP. It's a very rarely used rule. In fact, Tim Garrity, the guy who used to present this chapter stuff in Becker, said in his 40 million years as an accountant, I think it was like 40 years, but as long as he's doing accountant, he had never encountered an example of this. Okay. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And that's an example of the accounting principles rule. Okay. Specifically under generally accepted accounting principles. All right. Auditor senior's lack of post-review work papers. So let's see what we got here. Okay. I noticed that you reviewed the planning work papers for HMC, but not provided the review of the remaining work papers. Can you please explain? Senior says, as you noted, I reviewed the staff work during the planning stage, which is good, which showed due care and adequate knowledge. As a result, I did not review the audit work papers during the rest of the engagement due to the high level of confidence I have in our support staff. Well, it's good that the senior has high level of confidence in the support staff. Is it high enough to result in a no violation here? It is not. Due professional care is required over the course of the entire audit, not just in the planning phase where you can say, yeah, they're doing good work. I'm going to go work on my tan. I'm going to work on my golf game. Yeah, that doesn't work out that way. The senior has to do review of everything that the staff puts together. And the manager has to review everything the senior does, and the partner has to review everything everyone does. So that's a really, really important step. Which is this going to be a guideline of? This is going to be the general standards rule, okay? Which talk about staffing and professional guidelines and conduct of the engagement. Generally speaking, if you see something that has to do with work that's performed on the engagement, that's very, very general, the conduct of the quality of work, that's going to be the general standards rule. All right, last question. Confidential information provided to the in-charge partner. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's open our third exhibit. Letter to lawyer. Okay, I love the way this is titled. Lawyer. In response to the subpoena delivered June 1st, year 4, related to the pending lawsuit of HMC, please attach please find the requested confidential documents. Please say any questions. The in-charge partner. Lawyer. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So confidential information. Confidential information cannot be sent out. It is confidential. It's confidential. Obviously, you got to keep it confidential. So is there a violation in this circumstance? What do you guys think? Violation? No violation. They provide a partner provided confidential information, guys. What do you think?
Well, it was because of a subpoena.
Yes, very good. It's no violation because it was done in response to a legal summons. There are two situations in which this can be fine. Okay. So the confidential client information rule. That being said, there are two situations in which providing confidential information is perfectly acceptable. The first of these is response to a genuine legal summons, a subpoena, okay? Second of these is doing to an accounting oversight group that is doing review work in that area. An example of this would be the PCOB. If they requested confidential client information, they're an authoritative body. They can actually request that information and legally receive it, okay? So those are the two exceptions to the confidential information rule. Every other circumstance, confidential information has to remain confidential. All right. Good job. And we're done. Again, if you have any questions as you're preparing for the CPA exam, feel free to reach out. I should be available all summer, and I'm more than happy to help you out. If it's an extended question, I'm more than happy to jump on Zoom. We can talk about it. But I sincerely wish you the best of luck on the audit section. You guys are gonna kill it.